Moving on now to what can potentially be one of the scariest things about buying your first home, and that's the negotiation process. When you first start out, as I mentioned earlier, don't give away what you can spend, because an agent will pick up on that, and when it comes to the crunch, they're going to have the upper hand. Remember that negotiation isn't about price necessarily, it's about how you can meet the vendor needs, which may include time frames such as settlement, having early access to the property, repairing the property, furnishings, and the list really goes on. There's no limits of what can be included in the deal if that's what the vendor's needs are going to take to meet your needs. In the course manual, I go through an example of a house in Mitcham which was built in 1910 and had been vacant now for 17 years. Now to me, I wasn't ever really interested in buying this house, but there's a lot of potential on the negotiation process just due to the unique circumstances. The block was over 1,200 metres squared, therefore it was definitely a development site and the house was going to be bowled over. But also the fact the vendor didn't seem to care about rental income, they probably were in no hurry to sell, and because it had been vacant for 17 years, on a typical 25-year loan, even if they had bought it at that time and let it sit there, which is very doubtful, they would have had very little debt on the house, so letting it sit there was actually costing them no money. I also picked up that the house had been on the market a long time, because when I rang the agent, he didn't really seem to care, and what he did was just said, jump the fence, have a look through it yourself, rather than taking the effort to come down. So that shows to me that he's had a lot of interested buyers over the time, but none of them have given him probably a good enough price, and he was a bit sick of it. So to me, the vendor was probably motivated by price, and they advertised it in many different ways over probably a 9-month period to try and get that $500,000 figure. Again, psychology, maybe they wanted $500,000 rather than $495, just to say they had a house worth $500,000. So again, in just a 5-minute conversation, you can see how much information I'm able to draw by asking the right questions. So now I know the vendor is not motivated to sell quickly, they're probably motivated by price. Is the property worth this amount of money for this size land? Are there any issues with developing, which may be a reason it's also been on the market so long? Just for a bit of a fun exercise, I put together a few offers that I would personally put to the vendor. I was never interested in the property, but this goes to show how thinking outside the box can actually put a pretty good deal together, which can form a win-win between yourself and the vendor. I briefly mentioned earlier how one of my strategies to become a property investor was to vendor finance, where effectively I'm the bank. I calculated the interest on this property to be about $34,000 for a year. So taking that into account, traditionally, if I wanted to spend $500,000 for this house with the interest cost for the first 12 months, I could only offer $466,000. And knowing that the vendor has probably already rejected offers much higher than that, there's not much point putting that offer in because it's simply going to get rejected. The other way to go about the deal is to offer the vendor what they want, $500,000. But then it's going to actually cost me $534,000 once I take the interest into account. So I'm not going to offer that either because it's actually higher than I want to pay. The third option, which is more creative, is to do vendor finance. That way I can say to the buyer, how about we eliminate the bank so I don't have to pay that 34 grand's interest. So what I'll do, I'll give you $466,000 for the house plus the vendor finance interest over the next 12 months of $34,000. That way you get the $500,000 that you're after and I get to pay the price that I'd like to pay. Now in reality this example is probably not going to happen, but the point is looking outside the square, thinking about how you can do a better deal. Another simple way to go about this deal, if it was a smaller block which couldn't be developed, was to ask the vendor if they could have done repairs to broken windows, gutters, rotted floorboards, etc. And that way they could have spent the money on the property before I got in, so it's ready for me to go. So that way less of my cash has to be used up front. So again, I'd be paying the exact same amount that I'm prepared to pay, and the vendor will be receiving their end price. It's just the way that the figures are juggled in between so that both parties are happy.